Dawn broke over the restless waters of the Black Sea. Cold winds clawed at the sails of merchant ships and whipped across the docks of Sevastopol. Mist curled over the waves like smoke rising from a battlefield yet to come. Europe, still nursing the scars of revolutions and forgotten wars, seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beneath the gray horizon, an empire dreamed of expansion, while its neighbors feared the shadow of its ambition. The stage was set, not with a single shout or a sudden shot, but with whispers, threats, and the slow, grinding machinery of old grudges. In the winter of 1853, the Russian Empire stretched from the icy reaches of the Baltic to the wild steppes of the Caucasus. Its ambitions were as vast as its lands, yet its power was fragile, held together by fear and the loyalty of generals who measured courage in cannon fire. Across the continent, the Ottoman Empire trembled like a candle in the wind. Once a titan of conquest, it now clung desperately to the territories it had once seized with blood and steel. Its leaders whispered of decline, of revolts and rebels, and of an enemy pressing ever closer. The world outside the Black Sea was no less restless. Britain, whose navy had long ruled the waves, watched with unease as Russia's shadow crept south. France, recovering its own pride after years of revolution and Napoleonic ambitions, weighed the risks of intervention. And yet, even among these powers, there was hesitation. Each feared provoking war, yet none dared ignore the threat. In quiet drawing rooms, diplomats argued over maps, tracing lines with fingers and ink, as though drawing the fate of nations were as simple as charting a new frontier. On the ground, life carried on, unaware yet of the approaching storm. Villagers along the Crimean coast still tended their fields, fishermen mended nets by lantern light, and soldiers drilled under frostbitten skies. The cold seemed to seep into every bone, a prelude to the suffering that was to come. Yet even in this calm, the first sparks of violence began to flare. Border skirmishes, small raids, and rumors of massacres across the Danube began to thread a silent alarm through the region. Every report of Russian encroachment was met with Ottoman counterclaims, each one more desperate than the last. It was a war built on pride as much as policy. Tsar Nicholas I, heir to the Romanov throne, imagined himself the protector of Orthodox Christians and the ultimate arbiter of power in Eastern Europe. To him, the Ottoman Empire was not a neighbor but an obstacle, a relic of decline to be corrected with swords and cannons. Across the border, Sultan Abdülmecid I wrestled with a nation fraying at the edges. His advisors spoke of reform and diplomacy, of bribes and treaties, but the Tsar's shadow loomed larger with each passing day. The stage for confrontation was not shaped by fate alone. It was carved by human fear, ambition, and stubbornness. News traveled slowly, yet it carried weight. Reports of Russian troops massing in the Danubian principalities, crossing into Ottoman lands, and laying siege to fortresses reached London and Paris with a chill of inevitability. Each dispatch arrived like a dark prophecy, painting portraits of fire and blood over the serene landscapes of the Black Sea. In the drawing rooms of Europe, men in frock coats sipped wine and debated honor and obligation. But for the soldiers stationed along the frontier, the debate was unnecessary. They already knew the truth: war was coming. And then came the first screams. Not from distant generals, not from diplomats at their tables, but from the villages and towns caught in the crossfire. Reports of massacres, of towns burned to the ground, of women and children hiding in cellars while men fought for survival, began to trickle in. Europe's powers could no longer pretend neutrality. France sent emissaries. Britain debated intervention. The Ottoman Empire, bleeding yet defiant, called for allies. But even as treaties were drafted and alliances formed, the suffering of those at the front went unnoticed. The war would not wait for debate or diplomacy. It had its own rhythm, dictated by fear, hunger, and the bitter determination of men who believed their cause just. The soldiers who marched to the Black Sea were not mere pawns. They were men with dreams, families, and memories, now swallowed by the machinery of empire. Young Russian conscripts shivered in the winter mud, clutching rifles that had not yet tasted battle but would soon be stained with blood. Ottoman recruits, barely out of childhood, faced the grim reality of a war they did not choose. And across the waves, French and British officers sharpened swords, polished cannons, and rehearsed maneuvers, knowing that their nation's pride demanded action, even at the cost of human life. What made this war particularly tragic was its avoidability. In quiet chambers, negotiators could have found compromise. Borders could have been respected. Ambitions could have been tempered with dialogue rather than gunpowder. But pride is often louder than reason, and fear often outweighs caution. The Russian Empire's insistence on expansion collided with the Ottoman desire for survival, and Europe's powers, bound by treaties and rivalries, could not step back without appearing weak. So, step by step, the world moved closer to the brink, the Black Sea waiting like a silent witness to the human cost about to be exacted. Even as preparations were made for battle, the landscape itself seemed to mourn. The winds over the Crimean Peninsula carried the scent of salt and decay. Black gulls circled above cliffs, their cries echoing over the deserted beaches. Fishermen left their boats tied to rotting piers, sensing that the sea would soon run red. Snow began to fall over the distant mountains, covering them in white that would soon be stained by the footprints of armies. Nature, like man, watched silently, knowing that the peace of yesterday would not last. And so, as Europe stumbled toward one of its most tragic and avoidable wars, the Black Sea became more than a body of water. It became a mirror of human ambition, fear, and folly. It reflected the pride of empires, the desperation of nations on the edge, and the fragility of life for those who lived in its shadow. The first cannon shots had not yet been fired, yet the war had already begun in the hearts of men and women. Through whispered threats, through sleepless nights, through the silent shivering of soldiers in the cold. By the end of that winter, Europe would no longer be the same. Empires would rise and fall, alliances would shift, and countless lives would be lost. Not in some distant abstract war, but in battles fought on frozen hills, in burning towns, and in the cries of the innocent caught in the machinery of power. And all of it began, quietly, with the ashes over the Black Sea. The first sparks of a fire that would consume nations, families, and futures alike. Snow dusted the peaks of the Caucasus, glinting coldly under a gray sky. Across the frozen rivers and barren steppes, Russian soldiers moved like shadows, boots crunching in frost, muskets slung over shoulders stiff with cold. To the world, the movement of the Russian Empire was cloaked in words of protection, a noble mission to defend Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule. But behind closed doors, in palaces from St. Petersburg to Istanbul, the hunger for influence and expansion whispered louder than any justification. The bear had awakened, and Europe could feel the tremor beneath its feet. Tsar Nicholas I, heir of Romanovs, sat in his study, candles flickering against ornate walls, maps spread before him. His generals argued over strategy, pointing to provinces as if mere ink could dictate the flow of blood and history. Russia's armies were vast, yet supply lines were thin, and morale was fragile. Still, the Tsar's ambition burned brighter than any logistical concern. To him, the Ottoman Empire was a faltering giant, a neighbor too weak to resist, and the world beyond its borders, Britain, France, Austria, would flinch before the might of Russia's discipline and devotion. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, once proud and dominant, watched with growing fear. Sultan Abdülmecid I paced the halls of Dolmabahce Palace, listening to advisors debate reforms and alliances, each voice tinged with panic. The empire was bleeding, territories lost, corruption rampant, resources stretched thin. Yet the Russian advance was relentless. Reports of Cossack patrols crossing the Danube, fortresses taken with little resistance, and villages forced into submission reached Istanbul like a drumbeat of impending doom. And Europe watched. In London and Paris, diplomats and politicians read the dispatches with clenched jaws. Russia, long a distant power, now pressed close to the gates of the Mediterranean. Britain feared a world where the balance of power tilted irreversibly to the east, where Russian fleets patrolled waters once dominated by the Royal Navy. France, nursing both pride and paranoia, worried that hesitation would be seen as weakness. Fear spread faster than armies, turning councils into arenas of whispers, suspicions, and long nights lit only by the soft glow of oil lamps. Yet the bear's approach was not merely political. It was deeply human. Soldiers marched through snow and mud, enduring frostbite, hunger, and the monotony of waiting. Young conscripts, barely out of boyhood, followed orders they could not question, each step a quiet rebellion against the unknown horrors ahead. Officers rode along frozen roads, faces grim, knowing that the lives they commanded would soon be measured in cannon fire and bayonet thrusts. The Tsar's ambitions became their burden, a cold weight pressing against their shoulders, a silent specter haunting every campfire and frozen encampment. The tension was everywhere. On the Ottoman side, villages huddled behind stone walls, families whispering prayers while their men carried muskets that had not yet tasted battle. Cavalry units patrolled the Danubian plains, but caution often turned to panic as rumors of Russian incursions spread faster than troops could respond. Europe's powers had underestimated the speed of the bear's awakening. What began as a series of border skirmishes became a looming storm, each act of aggression escalating in silent, terrifying increments. And the war was already seeding tragedy. In a small town on the Danube, a merchant watched his fields burn as Cossack scouts passed through, taking livestock and leaving a trail of fear. Mothers clutched their children, praying for mercy that never came. Soldiers on both sides began to feel the cold reality of war before any formal declaration. Exhaustion, hunger, and the psychological strain of facing an enemy whose intentions were clear, yet whose strength was overwhelming. In the grand halls of Europe, the story was told differently. In London, the Foreign Office debated moral obligation versus strategic necessity, arguing over whether Russia's claim to protect Orthodox Christians was sincere or a pretext for conquest. In Paris, ministers whispered that delay might be dangerous, that only decisive action could preserve France's honor. Diplomats sent letters across the continent, each missive carrying both hope and threat. Yet these debates, conducted far from the mud and blood of the Black Sea frontier, could not capture the terror creeping through villages and camps alike. The Tsar's armies pressed forward with disciplined efficiency. Infantry drilled relentlessly, artillery crews practiced the art of destruction, and supply wagons creaked under the weight of gunpowder, food, and equipment. Each cannon rolled into position was a message. Russia had arrived, and it demanded recognition. Yet for every march forward, there were costs unseen by imperial planners. Soldiers fell ill in freezing tents, frostbitten fingers lost to the cold, morale fraying under the endless gray skies. The bear's awakening was a force of nature and human ambition combined, powerful, terrifying, and indifferent to suffering. Back in Istanbul, fear gave rise to desperate measures. Sultan Abdülmecid I called for reinforcements, attempted diplomatic channels, and issued proclamations meant to inspire courage in a population already trembling. Still, the empire's wounds were deep. Years of mismanagement, fading glory, and internal dissent had hollowed its strength. Each order to mobilize troops carried the weight of hopelessness, as soldiers prepared to face a foe whose size and discipline dwarfed their own. And yet they marched because to retreat was unthinkable, and to resist was a matter of honor, survival, and the faint hope that Europe might intervene. It was in this fragile intersection of ambition, fear, and desperation that the Crimean War began to take shape. Russia moved south with the hunger of a predator cloaked in virtue. The Ottomans braced for the storm, their people and soldiers caught between loyalty and survival. Britain and France watched with anxiety, calculating the cost of action versus inaction. And the world waited, unknowingly, for a conflict that would soon spill blood over rivers, plains, and cities, leaving scars that could not be erased. The bear's awakening was more than military movement. It was a moral and human reckoning. Each choice, from the Tsar's counsel to the orders given to a young conscript, rippled outward in ways unseen, shaping destinies, destroying livelihoods, and creating tragedies that would echo for generations. The clash of empires was inevitable, but the human suffering was immeasurable. A reminder that ambition, no matter how grand or justified, comes with a price measured in lives, not treaties. And so, as Russian banners rose over frozen plains and the first fires of conquest began to burn across the frontier, Europe understood. The bear had awakened. Its claws were sharp, its appetite vast, and its approach unavoidable. The world teetered on the edge of catastrophe, not because diplomacy had failed alone, but because the hunger of men and empires had outweighed caution, reason, and mercy. The Black Sea waited silently, its dark waters reflecting the first tremors of a war that would change Europe forever. And behind every cannon, every order, and every fearful glance, the truth remained. The awakening of the bear was also the awakening of human suffering, ambition, and the tragic inevitability of a conflict no one truly desired, yet everyone would pay for. The morning fog clung to the Bosphorus like a shroud. Istanbul stirred slowly beneath a sky gray with worry, its minarets slicing the clouds, silhouetted against a city on edge. Within the walls of Dolmabahce Palace, the Ottoman Empire's heart beat unevenly, weak, weary, and aware that the shadow of a rising giant pressed ever closer. The empire, once a lion of continents, now limped beneath the weight of centuries, corruption, and poor leadership. Its glory had faded, yet its people were still expected to fight, march, and die to preserve what remained. Sultan Abdulmajid I walked the echoing halls, his silken slippers soft against cold marble. Advisors crowded around him, voices clashing, trembling between panic and politics. Some pleaded for reforms, some whispered about appeasing Russia, others demanded immediate military response. The Sultan's face was pale, eyes lined with exhaustion, aware that every decision could cost thousands of lives, yet powerless to stop history from grinding forward. The empire's bureaucracy had grown bloated, its officials more adept at filling pockets than defending borders. Soldiers were trained poorly, provisions were scarce, and fortresses that had once withstood empires now looked fragile against the looming Russian advance. Outside the palaces, the streets of Istanbul were filled with tension. Merchants watched foreign diplomats arrive in gilded carriages, their presence a reminder that the world was paying attention. Citizens whispered of war, of taxes that would rise to fund armies they could barely feed. Mothers clutched children tighter at night, hoping the coming storm would spare them, while young men drilled in the morning light, their rifles crude and their uniforms ragged. Each footstep in the city echoed a larger truth. The empire's strength was waning, and the wounds of past mismanagement could not be healed overnight. The reality of weakness extended far beyond Istanbul. Along the Danube, Ottoman soldiers marched under frozen skies, boots sinking into mud and snow, muskets shaking in cold, untrained hands. Many were barely men, boys drafted to fight a war they could not imagine.
Discipline was fragile, loyalty fragile.
The shadow of Russian power hung over them like a storm cloud, and even their commanders could not mask their fear. They had been ordered to defend lands they barely understood, to resist an enemy whose size and skill dwarfed their own. Yet, in the heart of each soldier was courage, quiet, stubborn, and desperate, the kind born not from glory, but from the simple desire to survive. In the Ottoman army camps, fear mixed with confusion. Commanders gave conflicting orders, supplies failed to arrive on time, and illness spread faster than bullets. Horses went hungry, men grew weak, and the mud became a prison, swallowing boots and hopes alike. The empire's strength was a facade. It held together only by the fear of collapse. Each day, the young soldiers faced the terror of the unknown, unsure if they would return home, if their villages still stood, or if history would remember them at all. The war was not yet declared formally, but the suffering had already begun. Meanwhile, Russian forces pressed onward, their presence a constant reminder of the empire's fragility. Cossack patrols moved with precision and discipline, striking fear into towns along the border. Reports of burned villages, requisitioned supplies, and forced marches arrived in Istanbul like a drumbeat of impending doom. Every messenger carried not just news, but the psychological weight of inevitable defeat. The Ottomans were confronted with the unvarnished truth. Their empire was bleeding, and the wound was mortal if left untreated. Even the empire's leadership felt the sting of betrayal. Long-standing officials, whose loyalty had been purchased over decades, whispered among themselves, debating whether to resist or negotiate. Corruption had hollowed out the military and drained the treasury, leaving them ill-equipped to face Russia's assault. Generals argued over tactics, often blaming one another for failures beyond their control. Morale was fragile. Hope flickered briefly only to be extinguished by news of another fort falling, another village sacked, another frontier breached. The empire's heart throbbed with fear, and each beat carried the echo of a coming tragedy. The moral weight of leadership pressed heavily on Sultan Abdülmecid I. He was caught between the impossible choices of survival, honor, and diplomacy. Each decision rippled outward, touching lives in ways he could not foresee. Ordering a counterattack could send untrained soldiers to death. Appeasing Russia could mean ceding land, pride, and credibility. Every path was lined with suffering, yet history would judge him harshly for failure, whether by action or inaction. Leadership had become a knife edge, slicing through the lives of the empire's children, soldiers, and citizens alike. In the villages and small towns far from the palaces, life teetered between endurance and despair. Families hid their wealth from advancing Russian patrols, while neighbors argued over whether to flee or stay. Children played war games that mimicked the rumors they had heard, imagining battles with smoke and cannons, unaware of the real horrors that would soon come. Farmers abandoned fields, fearing looting. Merchants closed shops, fearing pillage. The empire's decline was not abstract. It was immediate, human, and painfully visible. Each person became a witness to decay, each household a small casualty of systemic failure. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. Fear gnawed at the population like a winter frost. Soldiers doubted orders, families doubted safety, and leaders doubted strategy. Desperation became a daily companion, threading its way through conversations, meals, and prayers. Even as reinforcements arrived sporadically, the empire's cracks were too deep, the damage too long ignored. Russia's advance illuminated what had been hidden for decades. The Ottoman Empire's greatness had become a shadow of its former self, a hollowed-out giant still expected to roar. And yet, despite the decay, the empire did not surrender. Pride and stubbornness held firm, even as logic whispered surrender. Fortresses were reinforced, troops were drilled despite their inexperience, and proclamations were issued to inspire courage. The Ottoman Empire, for all its flaws, still clung to life with a desperation that was both noble and tragic. Its leaders understood the human cost of war, yet they marched onward, a fractured empire carrying soldiers, civilians, and a centuries-old legacy into the teeth of a rising storm. The tragedy of this moment was inescapable. The empire's wounds were not inflicted solely by Russian cannons, but by decades of neglect, corruption, and decay. It faced an enemy that was prepared, disciplined, and hungry for influence, while its own strength faltered under mismanagement. And as the first cannon shots would soon echo across the Danube, it would be clear. The Ottoman Empire was bleeding, and its survival depended less on courage and more on the mercy of history itself. By the time Europe fully understood the vulnerability of the Ottomans, it was too late. Britain and France began to weigh intervention, yet the empire had already begun to pay the price. Every mismanaged supply, every untrained soldier, every delayed order was a wound that compounded the pain. The empire's decline was not a story of sudden collapse but of a slow, agonizing erosion, one that left its people exposed to the horrors of a war that would be remembered not for victories, but for suffering. And so, as the winter tightened its grip on Istanbul and the Danube plains alike, the empire bled quietly yet steadily. Its people carried fear in their hearts, soldiers carried exhaustion in their limbs, and leaders carried the unbearable weight of impossible choices. The stage was set for the next act. The failure of diplomacy, the entanglement of allies, and the march toward a war that would consume more than just armies. In the struggle between ambition and weakness, between preparation and decay, the Ottoman Empire would stand as both victim and testament, A broken giant facing a bear awakened. Candlelight flickered across the polished oak tables of European drawing rooms. Maps sprawled like battlefields yet unconquered, inked with borders that seemed fragile beneath the weight of ambition. Diplomats hunched over papers, quills scratching the surface of treaties that promised peace but carried the scent of looming bloodshed. Outside, the streets of London and Paris were quiet, almost indifferent, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for the storm that had been building for months. The Russian bear had awakened. Its troops pressed south, each march a silent threat, each cannon a whispered warning. Europe could no longer ignore the shadow that stretched from the frozen steppes to the Ottoman Balkans. Yet the path to war was not sudden. It was deliberate, slow, and fueled by pride. Diplomats argued behind closed doors, debating honor, morality, and the balance of power. Each negotiation, each missive, carried both hope and threat, a fragile dance where one misstep could ignite disaster. In London, the Foreign Office buzzed with anxious deliberation. Britain feared a world dominated by Russian influence, where the Mediterranean might fall under the control of an empire too vast to challenge. Ministers spoke in measured tones, citing treaties, commerce, and strategic interests. But beneath the polite phrases, there was fear that Britain's navy might not be enough, that inaction would embolden the bear, and that history would remember their hesitation as cowardice. Pride demanded intervention, and fear demanded action. Both led inexorably toward war. Paris was no less tense. France's ministers paced the halls of the Quai d'Orsay, their shadows flickering against the ornate walls. They spoke of honor, of national prestige, and of the need to assert power in a world increasingly dictated by the ambitions of others. The memory of Napoleon's shadow loomed large, a constant reminder that France's glory depended on action, not patience. The decision to enter the conflict would not be about loyalty to the Ottomans but about preserving France's place in history, ensuring that the rising bear did not redefine Europe without challenge. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, Sultan Abdülmecid I received reports that seemed to merge into a single, terrifying narrative. Russian forces continued their march. Fortresses and towns along the Danube were threatened, their defenses weak. His advisors argued over alliances, over whether Britain and France would act, and over the impossible odds his soldiers faced. The Sultan understood that diplomacy alone could not save his empire. Survival demanded allies, and the time for polite negotiation had passed. The Ottoman Empire, bleeding and fragile, would soon rely on the intervention of others to prevent collapse. The soldiers on the ground felt none of the political nuance. They saw only the approaching threat and the orders that demanded readiness. Ottoman conscripts drilled in frozen fields, rifles clutched tightly against numb fingers. Russian cavalry scouted the plains with terrifying precision, their discipline and speed a stark contrast to the ragged Ottoman lines. And as Europe debated morality and strategy, men on both sides prepared to face the reality of war: mud, blood, confusion, and fear. Human courage would soon be tested in ways that treaties and maps could not predict. Back in Europe, the corridors of power were filled with whispers, letters, and secret meetings. Envoys carried messages across borders, each word weighed with potential disaster. Britain and France began to outline the terms of alliance, not as saviors, but as wary participants acting out of necessity. Each side understood the stakes. If Russia succeeded unchecked, the balance of power in Europe would shift permanently. Intervention was not idealism. It was fear made manifest, a reluctant march toward inevitable conflict. The decision to intervene crystallized slowly, like frost forming on a windowpane. Britain dispatched fleets, their polished cannons gleaming under gray skies, ready to protect trade routes and prevent Russian domination. France mobilized troops and artillery, preparing to cross borders and rivers in support of the Ottoman cause. Orders were written and rewritten. Instructions passed from ministry to general, from general to officer, each layer introducing the potential for misunderstanding, delay, and disaster. And while the machines of empire moved deliberately, the human cost was already rising. Men would march, bleed, and die for decisions made in rooms far from the battlefields. In the towns and villages near the Ottoman front, the people sensed change. Rumors of Allied troops moving into position spread quickly. Farmers abandoned fields, merchants shuttered markets, and families prayed for a reprieve they feared would never come. Soldiers trained, sharpened blades, and drilled formations they barely understood, while commanders argued over tactics that might fail under fire. The world outside Istanbul had begun to move, and the empire was caught between hope and dread. Every march, every shipment, every strategic dispatch carried the shadow of inevitable conflict. By the time the first armies crossed into contested territories, Europe had already accepted the inevitability of war. Diplomats had failed, tempers had snapped, and alliances had solidified under the flickering light of candles and the heavy weight of pride. Britain and France were no longer distant observers but participants bound by fear and ambition. The Ottoman Empire, desperate and vulnerable, became the stage upon which great powers would clash. And Russia, confident yet blind to the human toll, pressed forward, believing in the righteousness of its mission. The human story of this march to war was not in the halls of diplomacy but in the frozen fields, the mud-choked roads, and the fearful hearts of soldiers. Young conscripts wondered if they would survive the first volleys. Mothers prayed for sons they might never see again. Officers carried the unbearable weight of responsibility, knowing that a single misstep could cost hundreds of lives. Across Europe, families readied themselves for news they dreaded, unaware that the war would not only redraw maps but leave scars in human memory that would never fade. Even as Europe moved decisively toward confrontation, the moral ambiguity of the moment was clear. Britain and France acted not out of loyalty to the Ottoman Empire but out of fear that Russia's unchecked expansion would reshape the continent. Pride demanded engagement. History demanded action. Diplomacy had been exhausted, compromise rejected, and the stage was set for bloodshed. What began as cautious negotiation had transformed into a march, deliberate, unstoppable, and tragic. And so, armies advanced, alliances solidified, and the first movements toward war became inevitable. Europe teetered on the edge of catastrophe, guided not by reason but by ambition, pride, and dread. The decisions of men in candlelit rooms, insulated from the cold winds and muddy plains, would ripple outward to touch thousands of lives, shaping the horrors yet to come. The march to war was not sudden. It was patient, relentless, and tragic, a prelude to battles that would stain rivers, fields, and cities with blood. In the end, the lesson of this march was bitter and human. War is born not only from aggression but from fear, pride, and the failure of those entrusted with reason. And as Russian, Ottoman, British, and French forces moved toward inevitable collision, one truth became clear. The world was about to learn, in the harshest of schools, the cost of miscalculation, ambition, and human folly. The stage was set. Cannons would roar, rivers would run red, and Europe would discover that peace, once possible, had already slipped away, sacrificed to the pride and fear of nations unwilling to yield. The march to war had begun, and nothing could stop it. Fog hung low over the Danube, clinging to the river like a thick veil. The water, dark and cold, reflected the gray sky above, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the violence that would soon stain its banks. Soldiers trudged through mud, their boots sinking deep, rifles heavy and hands numb. This was no parade of glory. This was war's grim reality. Bitter, relentless, and unrelenting. The first shots were about to ring out, and Europe would soon learn that this conflict would be neither quick nor clean. On the northern banks, Russian artillery rumbled softly, a distant growl that sent shivers through Ottoman soldiers. The Cossacks rode along frozen trails, their horses' hooves stirring the mist, a haunting rhythm that foretold chaos. Villagers peeked from behind shuttered windows, knowing that the sounds of preparation were the prelude to destruction. Every movement, every whispered order, carried the weight of fear. The Danube, once a quiet artery of life and trade, was about to become a corridor of suffering and death. Ottoman soldiers, clad in worn uniforms, froze in the mud, rifles trembling in their grasp. Many were conscripts. Young men plucked from villages, untrained, untested, yet expected to stand against a disciplined, hungry enemy. Commanders shouted orders, but the cries were often drowned in confusion and the roar of approaching cannons. Discipline frayed as fear crept into the hearts of men who had never fired a shot in anger. Each heartbeat was a drum, each glance a plea for survival. The Russians, disciplined and methodical, advanced with grim precision. Infantry in tight formations moved through fields and forests, artillery crews setting cannons into position with practiced efficiency. They were soldiers of experience, trained to strike quickly and without hesitation. For them, the Danube was a battlefield to dominate, a strategic river to control, and a stepping stone toward the Ottoman heartlands. Yet even they were human, feeling the weight of frost, fatigue, and the moral burden of lives they would soon claim. As the sun climbed, the first cannon fire shattered the morning quiet. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with fog and mist, and the smell of gunpowder cut through the cold air. The Ottomans returned fire, poorly coordinated but fierce in their desperation. The river became a theater of terror. Boats overturned, bridges shuddered under bombardment, and cries of wounded men pierced the fog. Europe could watch, but nothing could soften the truth. War had arrived, and it carried no mercy. In the villages along the river, civilians ran for cover. Families huddled in cellars, clutching children while the ground shook above them. Livestock panicked, and the river itself seemed to churn with fear. Every cannonball, every musket shot, became a punctuation mark in the unfolding tragedy. The war, once distant and abstract in diplomatic debates, was now immediate, tangible, and horrifying. Smoke, mud, and blood mingled in a tableau of suffering that no map could convey. Amid the chaos, leaders struggled to maintain control. Ottoman officers shouted, waved, and gestured, attempting to form lines from men who shook with fear. Russian generals barked orders, trying to coordinate attacks across foggy fields. Miscommunication was rampant. Men fired on imagined targets, artillery fell short, and confusion reigned. The battlefield itself seemed alive, bending strategy to chaos, reminding all who fought that war is as unpredictable as it is cruel. The human cost escalated with every volley. Young soldiers fell in the mud, eyes wide with shock, mouths open in silent cries. Officers were struck down trying to rally their troops. Wounded men screamed as comrades tried to drag them to safety, often in vain. Amid the smoke and carnage, courage flickered in small acts. A soldier shielding a comrade, a lieutenant carrying the wounded across a frozen field. Moments of humanity within the relentless machinery of violence. Europe's capitals followed the reports with horror and fascination. Maps were redrawn in rapid sketches, telegrams exchanged with urgency, and ministers debated the implications. Britain and France, now committed to intervention, prepared their troops, knowing that the conflict along the Danube was only the beginning. The world was witnessing a war that would stretch across borders, consume armies, and leave deep scars on civilians, soldiers, and empires alike. Yet for those caught in the first volleys, the calculations of kings and ministers were irrelevant. Only survival mattered. The weather, too, became an enemy. Rain turned the plains into quagmires. Cannon wheels sank into mud, dragging supplies behind them. Cold seeped into bones. Fatigue blurred judgment, and morale wavered. Commanders cursed the elements even as they shouted orders, knowing that nature itself had chosen a side in the unfolding tragedy. Every struggle was magnified by exhaustion, and every misstep carried fatal consequences. Yet even in the devastation, moments of tragic heroism emerged. Ottoman soldiers, despite poor training and chaos, held their ground in desperate pockets, firing until their muskets were empty. Russian troops advanced with discipline, yet paused to shield comrades or secure the wounded. Civilians risked their lives to flee, to rescue family, or to salvage what little remained. The Danube had become a crucible testing endurance, courage, and the human capacity to endure suffering. As dusk fell, The riverbanks were littered with the aftermath of the day's violence. Smoke hung low, mingling with mist and the cries of the injured. Bodies were dragged from mud and water. Cannonballs lay scattered like grotesque ornaments, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, fear, and blood. Europe had begun to understand a stark truth. This war would not be quick, nor would it be clean. Its cost would extend far beyond strategy or diplomacy, reaching deep into the lives of ordinary people who had no voice in the decisions that now shaped their destiny. The first shots over the Danube were a signal not only of battle but of the human tragedy to come. Soldiers on both sides had glimpsed the horror of modern warfare, the randomness of death, the cruelty of miscommunication, and the relentless grinding of empires into flesh and mud. The river, once a source of life and trade, had become a symbol of destruction and fear, a mirror reflecting the cost of pride, ambition, and failure. In the quiet that followed the day's battle, commanders met under the shadow of night, reviewing maps, casualties, and the impossibility of predicting what lay ahead. The soldiers slept uneasily in mud-choked camps, haunted by screams and visions of the fallen. Civilians tended to the wounded where they could, their prayers mingling with smoke and sorrow. And far across Europe, ministers, monarchs, and diplomats waited for reports, understanding that the war's first volley over the Danube was only the beginning. The tragedy of the river battle was that it revealed war in its purest, most human form. Confusion, fear, and courage intertwined. Soldiers learned that obedience could lead to death, that bravery was measured not in glory but in survival, and that the machinery of empires cared little for individual lives. Civilians discovered that distance from power offered no protection from its consequences. And Europe realized that the Crimean conflict, once an abstract struggle of pride and policy, was now vividly, painfully, irrevocably alive. By the end of the first day of fire over the Danube, the scale of human suffering became impossible to ignore. Armies, civilians, and leaders alike had glimpsed the tragedy of war, a spectacle of blood, mud, and despair that could neither be justified nor contained. The river had borne witness to the first chapter of violence, and its waters would remember every scream, every act of courage, and every death. The message was clear. Europe had stumbled into a war that would test empires, break soldiers, and leave the innocent to pay the cost. The Danube had been baptized in fire, and the lessons of this riverfront battle would echo throughout the Crimean campaign. A grim reminder that once empires clash, survival becomes a lottery, and tragedy touches all who stand in its path. The morning sky over Crimea was gray, heavy with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. Waves crashed against jagged cliffs, indifferent to the human struggle about to unfold on the shores below. Armies disembarked from battered ships, boots sinking into sand soaked with salt water and cold, their eyes scanning the horizon for forts, cannons, and death. The invasion of Crimea had begun, and with it, the first brutal lesson in the true cruelty of war. At Alma, the Russian defenders stood firm atop ridges, their artillery aimed with careful precision. Yet the Allies advanced, British and French soldiers moving in lines across open fields, the ground slick with mud and fear. Orders were shouted over the roar of cannon fire, often drowned by the chaos of the battlefield. Men froze, hearts hammering, as smoke curled around them and the air filled with the whine of bullets. Some charged with grim determination, others faltered, staring at the carnage that lay between them and the ridge. The clash was immediate, violent, and indiscriminate, strategy colliding with terror, and both exacting a heavy price. Confusion reigned. At Balaclava, the landscape itself seemed against the armies. Hills blocked sight lines, ravines trapped units, and mud swallowed wheels and boots alike. Messages between commanders were delayed, misheard, or lost entirely in the din of battle. Soldiers became isolated, fighting not only the enemy but the relentless uncertainty of their own orders. In this chaos, bravery was measured in inches, courage in seconds, and survival in chance. The fog of war was more than metaphor. It was flesh and bone, smoke and blood. Thousands fell in those first days. Men who had marched confidently from distant capitals now lay in mud, blood mingling with dirt and water. Horses screamed as artillery tore through lines, and cries of the wounded echoed across hills and valleys. Officers cursed, soldiers prayed, and commanders despaired, realizing that the fog of battle spared no one, regardless of rank or intent. Europe's view of war, orderly, decisive, noble, shattered under the raw reality of the Crimean campaign. Amid the chaos, human resilience flickered. Medics dragged men from under cannon fire, soldiers shielded comrades from bullets, and the terrified took inspiration from the courage of strangers. Small acts of bravery punctuated the horror. A lieutenant refusing to retreat, a conscript returning to rescue a friend, a civilian tending the wounded despite smoke and shellfire. These fleeting moments became the quiet testimony of humanity within a war designed to crush it. Sevastopol itself loomed ahead like a fortress carved from the earth. Its walls, thick and unyielding, were dotted with Russian defenders who knew that retreat was impossible. Smoke rose from ramparts as cannons fired incessantly, sending shells into approaching ships and infantry alike. For every step forward, the Allies paid in lives. For every victory gained, the cost was visible in mud, blood, and despair. The siege that had begun at Alma and Balaclava was a brutal prelude to the months of suffering that would follow. Orders from high command often worsened the carnage. At Alma, some units received conflicting instructions: advance, hold, retreat while under fire. Soldiers hesitated, debated, or obeyed blindly, only to find themselves exposed to artillery and musket fire. Fear and confusion became as deadly as the weapons themselves. The war revealed that human error, miscommunication, and the chaos of battle could be as lethal as any cannon or rifle. Meanwhile, the civilian population of Sevastopol and surrounding villages faced terror of a different kind. Smoke from bombardments obscured homes. Fires threatened granaries and workshops. Families huddled in cellars, listening to distant screams and the boom of artillery, uncertain if they would survive the next hour. The human cost of the siege extended far beyond the battlefield, touching every life within reach of the invading armies. Innocent men, women, and children became silent casualties of a war they neither started nor understood. Amid the carnage, leadership was tested and often failed. Commanders struggled to coordinate attacks across muddy fields and smoke-choked ridges. Russian generals worked desperately to hold positions, but supplies were limited, and morale wavered under relentless Allied pressure. On the Allied side, British and French officers contended with exhaustion, miscommunication, and the staggering number of casualties. The battlefield punished both planning and courage equally, reminding all that the machinery of war is indifferent to human intent. The weather became an additional adversary. Cold winds swept down from the mountains, chilling wet uniforms and frozen fingers. Rain turned the ground into a quagmire, making movement slow and exhausting. Mud clogged cannon wheels, slowed infantry, and swallowed artillery supplies. Soldiers huddled for warmth wherever possible, understanding that nature, like the enemy, could kill as easily as bullets or cannonballs. Every step, every maneuver, carried the dual threat of human and environmental peril. And yet, even in the midst of despair, the soldiers' humanity emerged. In fleeting moments, they paused to help comrades, shared meager rations, or whispered prayers. Some wrote letters in the dirt, hoping messages would reach loved ones. Others sang quietly, trying to cling to sanity amidst the horror. These moments, though brief, illuminated the resilience of the human spirit, even when surrounded by mud, fire, and death. The first assaults at Alma and Balaclava became grim lessons for Europe. News reached London, Paris, and Istanbul. The war would be long, bloody, and fraught with error. Strategies that had seemed sound on paper faltered on the ground. The true nature of modern warfare, confusion, fear, and suffering compounded by mismanagement, was revealed. And yet, despite staggering losses, the Allied armies pressed forward, driven by pride, fear of Russian dominance, and a reluctant sense of duty to the Ottoman Empire. As night fell over the battlefield, smoke lingered, mingling with mist and the cries of the dying. Officers counted losses, Soldiers tended the wounded, and survivors huddled wherever shelter could be found. The rivers ran dark, the earth was torn, and the horizon held no promise. Only the certainty of more violence to come. Sevastopol had not yet fallen, but the siege had begun, and Europe had glimpsed the terrifying truth. War was not abstract. It was immediate, personal, and devastating. The fall of Sevastopol, as it began at Alma and Balaclava, became a symbol of the Crimean War's human cost. Thousands of lives were lost not in decisive victories, but in confusion, fear, and orders that killed as surely as bullets. Civilians and soldiers alike paid the price of ambition, pride, and miscalculation. Europe's leaders could plan, dictate, and debate, but the battlefield revealed a far harsher reality, one measured in mud, blood, and suffering. And so, as the first smoke of Sevastopol rose into the gray sky, the lesson was clear. This war would be cruel, unrelenting, and deeply human. Confusion would rival cannon fire, fear would rival strategy, and survival would be the rarest prize. Alma and Balaclava were not merely battles. They were a brutal awakening to the cost of empire, pride, and ambition. The fall of Sevastopol had begun, and with it, the true cruelty of the Crimean War was revealed. Confusion, fear, and orders that killed far more than bullets ever could. Fog and smoke twisted across the Crimean plains like restless spirits. The morning sun struggled to break through, casting a dim, cold light on a battlefield already soaked in mud and blood. Horses pawed frantically at the frozen ground. Soldiers gripped rifles with white-knuckled hands, and the distant roar of cannons echoed across ridges. Somewhere ahead, the valley awaited. A stretch of land destined to become a graveyard, a monument to courage twisted into tragedy. The Light Brigade formed at the ridge, a line of horsemen glinting in steel, their faces a mixture of resolve and dread. Orders had come from high command, delivered with authority, yet blurred by miscommunication and haste. No one questioned the command. No one knew its full danger. They could see the valley ahead, a long, open stretch flanked by Russian artillery, bristling with cannons aimed like the fangs of some terrible beast. Silence fell as the horses waited, ears pricked, hoofs stamping, nostrils flaring in anticipation and fear. The charge began with a signal, a single voice shouting, "Forward!" The men leaned into their mounts, hearts hammering, spurs digging into flanks. Dust and smoke rose in their wake, swirling into the gray sky, masking the valley's lethal secrets. Down the slope they went, a tidal wave of men and horses, galloping toward certain death yet unable to turn back. For a single, horrifying minute, time seemed to stretch, a cruel paradox in which courage and doom collided. Cannon fire erupted, the first salvo tearing through the ranks. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the ground shook under the impact. Yet the charge pressed on, driven by discipline, honor, and a stubborn refusal to retreat. Bullets tore through the air, cutting down riders and steed alike. Some fell instantly, others struggled, entangled in harnesses or dragged under hooves. The valley became a crucible of bravery and miscalculation, a place where human courage was measured not in survival, but in persistence against overwhelming odds. Confusion reigned in the valley. Some riders veered off course, others collided with comrades, and yet all pushed forward, bound by the momentum of orders and the horror of hesitation. The terrain itself betrayed them. Mud bogged down horses, uneven ground tripped riders, and the artillery's deadly aim carved swathes through the charging column. For those caught in the open, the line between life and death narrowed to a heartbeat, a glance, a breath. Every step deeper into the valley carried the inevitability of catastrophe. From the Russian positions, gunners aimed with cold efficiency. Each cannonball that struck through men and horses into the air, flung them against the earth, or shattered their momentum in a spray of splinters and blood. Infantry waited behind the artillery, rifles poised to fire at the survivors. The valley was a trap, perfectly planned, perfectly deadly. Yet the Light Brigade surged onward, embodying a tragic blend of courage and obedience that would echo through history. Men screamed, hoofs thundered, smoke curled, and the sky seemed to darken with the toll of human life. Those who fell were often trampled by comrades, horses collapsing in mud and blood, rifles slipping from hands too weak or broken to hold them. Yet amidst the carnage, fleeting acts of heroism appeared. A rider shielding a wounded comrade, an officer spurring his horse to block fire, a soldier whispering a prayer as death loomed. These small glimpses of humanity were swallowed quickly by the valley's enormity. Yet they became the stories that would survive the slaughter. Observers from distant hills could hardly comprehend the scale of the tragedy. Cannons fired continuously, smoke obscured the landscape, and the cries of men and animals created a cacophony that seemed endless. The charge was not a moment of glory but a moment of horror, a microcosm of the Crimean War's wider truth. Strategy and valor could be undone in an instant by miscommunication, misjudgment, and the brutal calculus of the battlefield. As the survivors reached the far end of the valley, the toll was clear. Over half the brigade lay dead or wounded, horses scattered, and commanders stunned by the sheer destruction. Those who remained were exhausted, bloodied, and haunted by the cries of the fallen. The valley had claimed its due, a cruel testament to the cost of obedience and the futility of heroism in the face of superior firepower. Europe would later romanticize the bravery, yet the human suffering was immediate, raw, and undeniable. Back at headquarters, commanders argued, blaming errors on miscommunication and unclear orders. The mistakes that led to the disaster were dissected, debated, and documented. Yet for the men on the ground, there were no postmortems, no reports, only the visceral memory of horses collapsing, friends screaming, and the relentless roar of cannons. The moral weight of the charge of the Light Brigade fell not on generals, but on the men who endured, and on those who would tell their story in letters, diaries, and eventually history. The valley also became a psychological battlefield. Survivors staggered, haunted by the death around them, unsure why they had lived when so many comrades had perished. The chaos, confusion, and fear would linger long after the mud dried and the smoke dissipated. Some would never speak of it again. Others would carry the memory as a badge of honor tinged with guilt. The human cost of that single minute of courage would echo across Europe, shaping perceptions of the Crimean War as both heroic and tragically flawed. Civilians, too, bore witness. From nearby villages, they watched the tide of humanity rise and fall, the smoke thick and acrid, the screams piercing. Families hid in cellars, praying that the slaughter would spare them, yet knowing that death did not discriminate. Women and children would later tend the wounded, dragging men from mud and water, washing blood from uniforms and horses, and facing the unending reality of a war that spared neither the innocent nor the brave. By nightfall, the valley lay quiet, littered with the debris of battle. The bodies of men and horses were strewn across mud and water, cannons silent, rifles abandoned. Survivors huddled in small groups, trembling from exhaustion, fear, and grief. The charge of the Light Brigade had ended, not in victory, but in a haunting testament to human courage misapplied. For those who had lived, the memory would remain, indelible and unyielding, a grim emblem of the war's cruel logic. Across Europe, newspapers and letters conveyed the tragedy. Stories of valor intermingled with accounts of blunders, creating a complex narrative that combined heroism with horror. The charge became symbolic, a single minute that encapsulated the futility and bravery of the Crimean War. Leaders debated, poets memorialized, yet the survivors' trauma remained unacknowledged. The valley's lessons were clear. War is unpredictable, and human cost is immeasurable, often exceeding strategy and ambition. As the moon rose over Crimea, casting pale light over the valley, the battlefield seemed almost peaceful, yet its silence was deceptive. Beneath the mud, water, and frost lay the dead and dying, their sacrifice both meaningless and eternal. The Light Brigade's charge became a story of tragic heroism, yet for those who experienced it, there was no glory, only survival and sorrow. The valley had claimed its due, and Europe had witnessed the dark poetry of courage and chaos entwined. The charge of the Light Brigade was more than a military miscalculation. It was a human tragedy. It exposed the brutality of command, the unpredictability of war, and the profound courage of men facing impossible odds. The valley became a symbol of the Crimean War itself. Chaotic, relentless, and soaked in blood, it reminded all that history remembers the brave, but rarely the cost they bore. And so, as the first night fell on the Crimean plains, the valley lay in silent testimony. Smoke mingled with moonlight, mud hardened with frost, and Europe reflected on the cost of obedience, miscommunication, and courage misdirected. The charge of the Light Brigade would live in memory, a heroic tragedy written in a single minute of fire, forever illustrating the human price of war's cruel calculus. Snow fell relentlessly across the Crimean plains, blanketing the battlefield in a silence that was almost cruel. The white sheets of frost hid the mud, blood, and broken weapons beneath, but could not erase the sounds of human suffering. Soldiers trudged through frozen earth, boots soaked, fingers numb, and breaths misting in the bitter air. The guns were silent for the moment, yet the war continued, not with bullets or cannon, but with frostbite, hunger, and disease. The winter of 1854-55 became an enemy no general could command. Tents collapsed under the weight of snow, supply lines froze, and food rotted before it could reach men in the field. Soldiers, already exhausted from battle, now faced the relentless bite of cold. Uniforms offered little protection. Blankets were scarce, and firewood often ran out before nightfall. The wind howled across ridges, slipping beneath cloaks and through fingers, gnawing at bodies weakened by fatigue and hunger. The battlefield was no longer only a place of violence. It had become a landscape of survival. Disease crept silently among the camps. Cholera, typhus, and dysentery moved faster than any cavalry, claiming men who had survived cannon fire and musket volleys. Medical supplies were insufficient, hygiene almost non-existent, and even the most disciplined soldiers fell to fever and infection. The cries of the sick mingled with the whistling wind, creating a haunting symphony of pain that no artillery could produce. Every death, slow and agonizing, underscored the fragility of human life in a war defined not only by battle but by neglect. Hunger gnawed at every soldier. Rations were meager and often spoiled, forcing men to scavenge or share what little they had. Frosted bread, frozen meat, and lukewarm tea became their sustenance, barely enough to sustain the body through the endless days. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and hope in equal measure, but the cold spared no one. Even the strongest succumbed to exhaustion and exposure. Armies that had once moved with pride and discipline now staggered like shadows, hollow-eyed and haunted. The officers, too, felt the winter's bite. Commanders argued over scarce resources, often frustrated by the inefficiency of supply chains or the disobedience of exhausted troops. Decisions carried impossible weight, for one wrong command could condemn dozens to death in the snow. Morale faltered as hope diminished. Letters from home arrived rarely, bringing news of distant warmth and food, a reminder of what life could be beyond the frozen front. The human mind, like the body, suffered under relentless deprivation. Snowstorms swallowed communication lines. Messages between headquarters and front lines were delayed, lost, or destroyed. Orders arrived too late, often misunderstood, and the soldiers faced each day without clear guidance. In this winter, confusion rivaled bullets as a killer. Men froze while waiting for instructions. Others perished attempting to follow orders that never came. The war became a test of endurance, patience, and the human spirit, showing that nature itself could wield power as devastating as any army. In the trenches, misery was palpable. Soldiers dug through frozen earth to create shelter, only to find it collapsing under snow and ice. Fires were difficult to light, smoke revealing positions to the enemy, leaving men shivering and exposed. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs, leaving survivors maimed and unable to perform the simplest tasks. Each day, the line between life and death narrowed, and the battlefield transformed into a harsh tutor, teaching lessons in endurance, suffering, and the unforgiving reality of nature. Amid this despair, small acts of humanity shone through. Soldiers shared blankets, tended the wounded, and offered words of comfort despite their own suffering. Some risked frostbite to bring water or food to comrades. Others simply held hands or offered a shoulder in shared misery. These moments, though brief, were beacons of light in a frozen hell. They revealed that even in the depths of war's cruelty, empathy and courage endured. The winter also brought psychological torment. Men witnessed comrades frozen in the snow, lifeless bodies forming grim patterns along the trenches. The living feared every step, every gust of wind, knowing that frostbite could strike as easily as a bullet. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the groans of the sick and dying. Hope became a fragile thing, sustained only by the thought that the war, though relentless, would eventually end, though none knew when. Leaders in London, Paris, and Istanbul monitored the winter's toll with mounting anxiety. Reports of disease, starvation, and frostbite shocked ministers who had imagined the war as a contest of cannons and rifles, not endurance and human fragility. Supplies were rushed, reinforcements sent, and strategies adjusted, yet the armies continued to suffer. The winter exposed the limits of planning, the vulnerability of men far from home, and the cruel impartiality of nature. Strategy, honor, and discipline mattered little when frost, disease, and hunger became the true adversaries. In Sevastopol, the Russians endured the cold with similar agony. Trenches filled with water, supplies dwindled, and men struggled to maintain fortifications while shivering and starving. Disease crept through their ranks as it had through the Allies, and the human cost mounted on both sides. Even in defense, bravery could not shield them from the merciless winter. The battlefield had become universal in its cruelty, reminding Europe that no army, however disciplined, could conquer frost and disease alone. Amid the snow, the wounded cried out for help that often never came. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, stretched thin by the sheer number of casualties compounded by illness. Nurses worked tirelessly, hands numb, bodies trembling, tending to men dying not from bullets but from neglect, cold, and exhaustion. Every life saved was a small victory against a relentless tide of suffering. These moments became the hidden stories of the winter, battles fought not with weapons, but with compassion and tireless effort against the cruelty of circumstance. By the end of the winter, armies were diminished, morale fractured, and the battlefield itself transformed. Trenches were frozen tombs, artillery bogged down, and human resilience tested beyond imagination. Frostbite, disease, hunger, and exhaustion had claimed more lives than any single cannonball. The winter had devoured armies, leaving survivors scarred, haunted, and painfully aware of the fragile line between life and death. The bitter lesson of the Crimean winter was simple yet profound. War is not fought solely on battlefields. Nature, neglect, and human frailty can claim just as many lives as strategy and bullets. Armies that survive frostbite and disease may yet face enemy fire, but the memory of suffering lingers, shaping the men who endure and haunting those who watch from afar. Europe would remember the battles of men, but history would often overlook the cruelty of winter, the silent adversary that killed without glory, judgment, or honor. And so, as the snow blanketed Crimea, hiding the dead and the dying beneath its silent, cold cover, soldiers clung to life in desperate hope. The winter of 1854-55 had revealed the harshest truths of war, the fragility of the human body, the relentlessness of nature, and the unbearable weight of survival when the enemy is both seen and unseen. Armies would march again, cannons would roar, and battles would continue, but the memory of that winter, frozen, merciless, and consuming, would linger forever, a silent testament to the human cost of ambition and pride. Twilight fell over the Crimean hospitals, a thin, gray light filtering through smoke-stained windows. The corridors reeked of sickness, blood, and despair. Men moaned in pain, their bodies racked by disease, frostbite, or wounds that no surgeon had the time to tend. The winter had already claimed countless lives, but here, in these crowded rooms, another war raged. One fought not with rifles and cannons, but with bandages, compassion, and relentless human effort. Into this chaos stepped Florence Nightingale. Tall, determined, and resolute, she moved with a purpose that cut through the despair. Her eyes, sharp and watchful, surveyed the suffering with both horror and resolve. Nurses followed, carrying water, cleaning bedding, and tending to wounds in rooms that were overcrowded, freezing, and dimly lit. Every action was a small rebellion against the indifference of war, a defiance against the scale of human suffering that seemed impossible to contain. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Rows of men lay on straw-strewn floors, some screaming, others silent with fever or shock. Disease spread unchecked. Cholera, typhus, and dysentery moved faster than any army, claiming soldiers who had survived battles only to face death in crowded wards. Supplies were scarce. Bandages were reused, beds shared, and medicine rationed to the point of futility. Every nurse knew that the challenge was more than tending wounds. It was combating neglect, bureaucracy, and the relentless cruelty of circumstance. Nightingale's presence brought structure to the chaos. She moved from bed to bed, checking temperatures, changing dressings, and organizing ration lines. Her voice, calm yet firm, became a lifeline in the storm of suffering. Soldiers whispered her name with gratitude, even as many wondered how one woman could possibly make a difference in a place overwhelmed by misery. Yet her methods, simple and relentless, cleanliness, organization, and constant attention, began to turn despair into survival. The work was brutal and unending. Nurses labored from dawn to nightfall, their hands chapped, their bodies stiff from cold, and their eyes hollow from exhaustion. They scrubbed floors, boiled water, and carried buckets of snowmelt to mix with meager rations. In a world where death seemed omnipresent, they clung to life through their tireless devotion. Even small victories, a soldier's fever breaking, a wound healing, a man smiling despite pain, became triumphs against the shadow of war. Outside, the battlefield continued its relentless rhythm. Injured men were carried in on stretchers, freezing and pale, some barely conscious. Each new arrival strained the hospital's capacity, pushing nurses and staff to the brink. The cries of the wounded mixed with the howling wind outside, creating a symphony of suffering. Nightingale and her team moved tirelessly through it, organizing wards, cleaning and comforting, a human shield against the horror that threatened to overwhelm them. Disease was a constant enemy. The cholera epidemic had killed more men than any cannon at Alma or Balaclava. Every bed carried risk. Every touch could transmit sickness. Yet the nurses persevered, donning soaked cloaks and gloves, risking their own health to tend the dying. They learned to improvise, to clean with what little they had, to make warmth and sanitation where there was none. Each act, though small, saved lives. Each life saved became a defiance of the cruel arithmetic of war. Morale in the hospitals was fragile. Soldiers faced not only their injuries but the psychological toll of winter, battle, and uncertainty. Letters from home were rare, food was insufficient, and the shadow of death loomed over every bed. Nightingale and her nurses became not only healers of the body, but guardians of hope. Their presence reminded men that someone, somewhere, cared, that the world outside the battlefield still held compassion. It was a fragile lifeline, yet a vital one. The work extended beyond tending to the wounded. Nightingale implemented strict hygiene practices, instructing nurses to scrub floors, boil linens, and ensure ventilation wherever possible. These measures, simple by today's standards, were revolutionary at the time, dramatically reducing mortality rates. She faced resistance from officers who resented her intrusion and from soldiers unaccustomed to such discipline. Yet her insistence on order and cleanliness transformed the hospitals from death traps into places of survival. Night fell, and with it came exhaustion, yet the work never ended. Soldiers groaned, frostbitten and fevered, while nurses carried on, offering water, adjusting blankets, and whispering reassurances. Each night became a battle in itself, a struggle against neglect, disease, and despair. The darkness, cold, and quiet became witnesses to countless acts of quiet heroism. The small, unseen victories that history often overlooks. Stories of Nightingale's efforts spread. Soldiers whispered of the lady with the lamp, moving through wards with a steady light, checking on men while the wind howled outside. Her reputation grew, not as a figure of power or authority, but as a symbol of humanity in a landscape otherwise defined by suffering and death. Each life she saved was a testament to the impact of compassion and determination in the midst of overwhelming horror. Despite tireless efforts, the human cost remained staggering. Thousands had died before reaching the hospitals. Thousands more would succumb to disease and exposure. Nightingale and her nurses could not change the war, but they could influence its consequences, softening its blow and restoring dignity where it had been stripped away. In doing so, they left a legacy that would extend far beyond Crimea, transforming the very concept of wartime care. By the end of the winter, the hospitals, though still crowded and chaotic, had become beacons of survival. Soldiers who would have died now walked again, wounded but alive. The methods implemented by Nightingale and her team had begun to ripple outward, influencing hospital practices across Europe. Their quiet defiance against neglect and disease proved that even in the darkest moments, human initiative could save lives. The Crimean winter had revealed the fragility of human life, the indifference of nature, and the horrors of modern war. Yet within these hospitals, a different war was being waged, one of hope, compassion, and tireless effort. Nightingale and her nurses became the unseen warriors, confronting death in its quietest, most insidious form. They fought not with guns or cannons, but with humanity, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to life. In the dying light of day, the wards fell silent, broken only by the occasional moan or cough. Nightingale moved among the beds, checking on each soldier, offering a reassuring word, and preparing for another day of relentless work. The world outside continued its war, but within these walls, she and her nurses had carved out a fragile sanctuary, a place where lives could be preserved amidst destruction. Europe would remember the battles of Crimea, the charge of the Light Brigade, the winter that devoured armies, but the quiet, courageous work of Nightingale and her nurses remained less visible. And yet, without their tireless efforts, the human cost would have been even higher. They were the angels in the darkness, bringing light, order, and hope to a world consumed by chaos and death. The hospitals of Crimea became a testament to what humanity could achieve even amidst relentless suffering. Soldiers lived, wounded but alive. Nurses endured, despite exhaustion. And hope, fragile and flickering, refused to be extinguished. The war raged outside, yet within these walls the battle against neglect and death was won, one small act at a time. And so, as night fell over the frozen plains, the lamps burned steadily in the hospitals. The shadows of suffering were illuminated, and the legacy of Florence Nightingale and her nurses began to take shape. A quiet, enduring reminder that even in war's darkest hours, compassion could prevail, saving thousands and forever changing the way humanity confronts suffering. Smoke hung low over Sevastopol, curling into a sky already heavy with ash and frost. Trenches carved into the earth were filled with soldiers shivering in mud, their uniforms tattered and soaked. Every cannon fired, every musket discharged, sent echoes across the city's shattered walls. The siege had begun months ago, but the brutality intensified with each passing day. This was not a battle of honor or strategy. It was a war of attrition, designed to grind men into dust and exhaust an empire. Allied forces advanced slowly, inch by inch across the frozen plains. Artillery fire tore through barricades, yet the Russian defenders held firm. Each fort, each parapet, became a tomb and a monument, testing the patience, courage, and endurance of every man on both sides. Supplies dwindled, hunger gnawed relentlessly, and disease spread as easily as cannon smoke. The siege transformed from a military operation into a trial of human survival, a slow-motion nightmare where hope flickered and died in the cold trenches. At every turn, confusion and fear were constant companions. Soldiers hesitated under fire, unsure if orders would reach them or if their efforts were in vain. Smoke obscured vision, artillery misfired, and messages were delayed, leaving units isolated and vulnerable. The chaos of command compounded the terror on the ground. Men died not only from bullets but from the consequences of human error, miscommunication, and exhaustion. War revealed itself as a cruel arithmetic, where numbers, strategy, and courage could not always save the living. Sevastopol's defenders, though beleaguered, showed a tenacity born of desperation and pride. Russian soldiers dug deeper into fortifications, repaired walls under fire, and rationed every last morsel of food. Disease ravaged the ranks, but morale, fueled by the knowledge that their city must not fall, remained stubbornly intact. Each day of resistance was a testament to human endurance, even as the weight of the siege pressed down like the cold gray sky above. The trenches became a theater of misery. Men fought while freezing, hungry, and sick. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Wounds festered under unrelenting cold and filth. Cannon fire shredded mud and bodies alike. Survivors dragged the wounded from the line, often at the risk of their own lives. The siege had stripped war down to its most essential and cruel elements: survival, endurance, and suffering. Glory existed only in survival. Heroism was measured by who lived to see another day. At night, the city glowed with fire and smoke. Russian fortifications, scorched and battered, still held against the relentless Allied assault. Within the ruins, soldiers huddled for warmth, sharing blankets, whispered prayers, and meager rations. Some wrote letters in the dirt, hoping words would somehow reach loved ones. Others simply closed their eyes, counting breaths, waiting for dawn and fearing what it would bring. Each night became a silent witness to the grinding toll of prolonged conflict. Commanders on both sides faced impossible decisions. Every assault, every defensive maneuver, carried the potential for disaster. Orders were issued with the knowledge that many would die executing them. Fear and pride intertwined, creating moral dilemmas for leaders who were human as well as strategic minds. Lives were lost not only to enemy fire but to the weight of command, the slow unraveling of morale, and the exhaustion of men pushed beyond human limits. Civilians remained trapped within Sevastopol, bearing witness to a war that offered them no mercy. Homes were reduced to rubble. Smoke and ash filled the streets. Families hid in basements and cellars, praying for the day the siege would end. Food was scarce, water often tainted. Children and women tended to the wounded, carrying water, cleaning bloodied clothing, and whispering comfort to soldiers they had never met. The siege spared no one, and survival became a shared struggle between defenders and civilians alike. Artillery fire was relentless. Cannons boomed day and night, throwing shells into the walls of Sevastopol. The ground shook, windows shattered, and dust and rubble rained down on the city. Each day of bombardment increased the death toll, yet the Russians held their positions with stubborn defiance. Every inch of ground gained by the Allies came at a staggering cost in lives and morale. Sevastopol had become both a fortress and a graveyard, resisting conquest through human courage and endurance. Disease continued its quiet march. Cholera and dysentery claimed more lives than bullets, spreading through cramped trenches and overcrowded hospitals. Soldiers already weakened by hunger and frostbite succumbed to illness, their screams echoing faintly against ruined walls. The siege revealed the harsh truth. War was not won solely by strategy or weapons. Survival depended equally on health, logistics, and the resilience of the human spirit, and all were in short supply. Yet amidst the horror, human courage persisted. Soldiers dug, repaired, and fought while fevered and starving. Nurses and medics worked tirelessly to save lives, even when hope seemed lost. Civilians assisted wherever they could, defying fear and exhaustion. The siege stripped humanity to its barest form, yet in those small acts of perseverance and compassion, the endurance of the human spirit shone through, fragile yet unbroken. As the siege dragged into months, Sevastopol became a symbol. For Russia, it embodied pride, resilience, and the unyielding will to resist. For the Allies, it became a measure of their determination, patience, and the steep price of victory. Mud, blood, and rubble blurred the lines between heroism and suffering. The siege had stripped warfare to its essence, a brutal test of endurance, strategy, and the human soul. By the end of the first year, the siege had reshaped both armies. Men who had survived cannon fire now bore scars of frostbite, disease, and exhaustion. Leaders realized the limits of command. Strategy was tested against relentless human suffering. The city itself had become a microcosm of the war, relentless, chaotic, and soaked in the blood of men whose courage would never be forgotten. The Siege of Sevastopol revealed the unflinching cruelty of war. Victory was measured not in glory but in survival, in inches of ground, in fleeting moments of human perseverance. Soldiers endured mud, bullets, frost, and fever, each day a testament to the cost of empire and ambition. Civilians lived alongside them, witnessing horror, sharing fear, and participating in survival. Sevastopol became a symbol of the Crimean War itself, relentless, bloody, and unyielding. And yet, even in this darkness, small victories illuminated the human capacity for resilience. Survivors learned to navigate trenches, treat wounds, ration food, and endure conditions that would have broken lesser men. Nurses and medics saved lives in impossible circumstances, providing hope and order amidst chaos. Even amidst relentless destruction, these moments became a testimony to the endurance of humanity in the face of overwhelming suffering. As night fell over Sevastopol, the city and its defenders remained standing, battered but unbroken. Smoke drifted over the ruins, mingling with frost and the distant echoes of cannon fire. The siege had begun as a tactical operation but had evolved into a human crucible, testing courage, endurance, and compassion. Men would continue to die, the city would continue to resist, and Europe would watch, horrified by the human cost. The Siege of Sevastopol would last nearly a year, each day a slow, grinding ordeal. Armies on both sides were changed forever by mud, blood, and the relentless cruelty of attrition. The city became both fortress and grave, and the war revealed an immutable truth. When empires clash, survival becomes the ultimate act of courage, and the cost of ambition is counted not in strategy, but in the suffering of every man, woman, and child caught in its path. Winter had loosened its grip on Crimea, yet the echoes of frost and misery lingered in every trench and fort. Across the vast Russian steppe, the Tsar's armies, once proud and seemingly invincible, were battered, broken, and haunted by months of relentless conflict. The Crimean War had revealed the fragility of an empire whose image of power was built on pride, ambition, and myth. Now, in the shadow of defeat, that myth began to crumble. At Sevastopol, the siege had stripped the Russian army of both numbers and morale. Trenches were emptying faster than reinforcements could arrive. Supplies were exhausted, ammunition dwindled, and the wounded lay in makeshift hospitals, many without hope of survival. Soldiers who had marched bravely across snow, mud, and cannon fire now staggered under hunger and exhaustion, their loyalty to the Tsar tested by the cruel reality of war. The empire's grand illusions of strength faced the cold, unyielding truth. Survival demanded more than bravery. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, the shockwaves of failure rippled through palaces and council chambers. Courtiers whispered about the inefficiency of generals, the corruption of supply chains, and the incompetence of administration. The Tsar himself, Nicholas I, had relied on rigid hierarchy and outdated strategies, assuming that courage alone could sustain the empire's power. But courage, it turned out, was no match for the modern realities of war, artillery, medicine, logistics, and morale. The bear, once feared, was revealed as vulnerable, slow, and human. Every battle, every siege, every skirmish had left marks that no parade could erase. At Alma and Balaclava, Russian soldiers had fallen by thousands, many in moments of confusion and miscommunication rather than enemy fire. At Inkerman, the frozen earth swallowed men in trenches where frostbite was as deadly as the bullet. Disease had moved silently, claiming more than cannon ever could, and the winter of 1854-55 had reduced an army of tens of thousands into ragged survivors, hollow-eyed and shivering. The cost of ambition was measured in lives, and Russia's ledger was heavy with blood. As news of defeat spread, panic and disillusionment began to infiltrate the ranks. Soldiers whispered that the Tsar's promises were empty. Officers argued over strategy in tense, fearful councils. The rigid discipline that had once been Russia's strength now became a source of tension. Some refused orders, others faltered under bombardment, and morale fractured as men realized that loyalty alone could not protect them. War, they understood, demanded more than obedience. It demanded preparation, foresight, and adaptability, all of which the empire lacked. In the Kremlin, officials debated the next steps with grim faces. Peace negotiations were considered, though pride and fear delayed decisions. Every day the conflict continued, the bear weakened further. Armies that had once seemed unstoppable were now reduced to shadowy remnants of their former power. The cost of arrogance and outdated strategy became undeniable. A nation could project might across borders, but when that projection collided with reality, human suffering became the measure of failure. Meanwhile, in Sevastopol and across Crimea, Russian soldiers endured the relentless fire of Allied forces. Trenches were riddled with artillery holes, fortifications shattered, yet defenders held on, a mixture of stubborn pride and desperation. Survival often outweighed strategy. Commanders realized that even if the city did not fall, the empire itself was in crisis. The bear was bruised, bleeding, and exposed, no longer the monolithic force that Europe had feared. Morale became the silent battlefield. Men whispered about lost comrades, frozen nights, and futile charges. The glory of the Tsar's army, once celebrated in song and story, was replaced by exhaustion and dread. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion, but the psychological toll was immense. Mutiny, desertion, and despair threatened the very foundation of command. The bear was faltering, not in a single decisive battle, but under the cumulative weight of attrition, disease, and incompetence. Across Europe, diplomats sensed the bear's weakening grip. Britain and France, though battered themselves, recognized the opportunity and danger inherent in Russia's overreach. The war had exposed deep flaws in the Tsarist system. Rigid hierarchy, poor logistics, inadequate medical care, and a lack of modernized military doctrine. The empire's armies had been brave, even heroic at times, yet bravery alone could not sustain a failing machine. The collapse was inevitable, not in the dramatic surrender of a single battlefield, but in the slow erosion of human capacity and organizational decay. In the towns behind the front lines, families felt the human cost of the bear's collapse. Letters arrived late or not at all. Supply shortages meant hunger for civilians as well as soldiers. The economic strain began to show, with trade disrupted, crops lost, and families suffering. The Crimean War, intended to project Russian power, had instead revealed vulnerabilities that cut deep into the social and political fabric of the empire. The collapse was systemic, not only military, and it would leave scars for decades. The bear's suffering was mirrored in the army's attempts to regroup. Reinforcements arrived sporadically, ill-equipped and exhausted. Commanders clung to hope that sheer numbers might restore strength, but the momentum of failure was unstoppable. Every counterattack faltered. Every defensive effort was costly. Exhausted men faced enemies who were equally tired but better supplied and increasingly organized. Sevastopol's endurance could not hide the larger truth. The empire had overextended itself and now paid the price in blood and humiliation. Even as the war continued, Russia's leadership confronted a harsh realization. The image of an unstoppable empire was shattered. Soldiers had fought with courage and determination, but they were human, subject to hunger, frost, disease, and fear. The machinery of empire was flawed, and its decay had been exposed for all of Europe to see. The collapse was not sudden, but creeping, measured in the shivering eyes of men in trenches, the hollow faces of nurses tending the sick, and the whispered doubts of officers who knew the empire's pride could not survive prolonged failure. By the time peace negotiations began, the bear had been irrevocably weakened. Tsar Nicholas I had passed, replaced by a son burdened with the aftermath of mismanagement and defeat. The army that had once inspired fear across Europe now limped home, broken, disillusioned, and haunted by the human cost of ambition. The collapse of the bear was not a single act of surrender, but a slow recognition that power, no matter how vast, must be tempered by foresight, compassion, and humility. The Crimean War had exposed the empire's vulnerabilities in the starkest terms. Bravery alone could not sustain an empire. Discipline alone could not protect its soldiers. Disease, cold, hunger, and mismanagement had claimed more lives than enemy bullets. Human courage had met the limits of bureaucratic efficiency and strategic vision. Russia, the great bear of Europe, had been humbled not just on the battlefield, but in the stark calculus of survival and consequence. And so, as the sun set over the Crimean plains, the empire that once seemed invincible faced the bitter truth. Bravery could not mask weakness, and ambition could not protect against decay. The bear had roared, clawed, and resisted, yet the human and systemic costs of war had revealed its fragility. Soldiers returned home scarred, families mourned, and Europe reflected on the cost of overreach and pride. The collapse of the bear was complete, a lesson etched in mud, blood, and frost, forever altering the perception of Russian might in the 19th century. The guns finally fell silent over Crimea. No triumphant cheers echoed across the plains. No banners waved in victory. Only the wind moved, carrying the smell of mud, smoke, and the lingering echo of human suffering. The war, which had raged with fire, frost, and blood, was over. But its cost was carved into the landscape, the bodies of men, and the hearts of nations. Peace had arrived, but it was not a gift. It was a bitter settlement written in graves. Across the battlefields, bodies lay frozen, burned, or bloated in the mud. Trenches were filled with the dead, abandoned weapons scattered beside them like relics of a nightmare. Allied and Russian soldiers alike had perished in staggering numbers, their deaths rendered meaningless by the scale of destruction. Each grave marked not just a life lost, but a story of hope, fear, and courage extinguished before its time. Mothers, fathers, and lovers would mourn, carrying grief across rivers and borders, long after treaties were signed. The cities bore the scars of ambition. Sevastopol, once a proud fortress, was shattered. Homes and streets lay in ruins, smoke curling from blackened rubble. Civilians who had survived endured hunger, disease, and the terror of constant bombardment. They buried their dead where they could, scavenged for food, and tried to reclaim fragments of their lives. Peace offered little comfort to those whose entire world had been consumed by war, whose families had been scattered, and whose future was uncertain. Diplomats in Vienna, London, Paris, and Istanbul signed treaties by candlelight, shaking hands over maps and ink-stained papers. Borders were redrawn, spheres of influence adjusted, and the great powers claimed victory in words. Yet for the soldiers and civilians who had endured frost, disease, and gunfire, victory felt hollow. Political gain could not resurrect the dead, restore frostbitten limbs, or heal the scars of fever and despair. Peace was a declaration on paper, but the cost remained alive in every grieving heart. Russia, humbled and fractured, faced a nation exhausted by war. The empire's pride had been wounded, its armies diminished, and its people haunted by the toll of ambition. Soldiers returned home, shells in their eyes, frostbite in their fingers, and sorrow in their hearts. Families awaited them, some to embrace, others only to bury. Europe had witnessed the limits of imperial power. Courage could not erase neglect, bravery could not overcome disease, and ambition could not withstand mismanagement. The bear had roared, but now it limped home, weakened and introspective. For Britain and France, the war revealed both competence and folly. Soldiers had endured frost, hunger, and disease alongside their Russian counterparts. Yet their supply chains, medical care, and planning had been tested to the extreme. The price of pride was evident in hospitals filled with fevered men and graves unmarked by names. Victory was tempered by a haunting awareness that strategic gains had been purchased with a human cost almost impossible to calculate. Peace, in essence, was a fragile truce with the shadows of suffering that lingered long after. The Ottoman Empire, though spared complete collapse, remained fragile. Its cities were scarred, its military humiliated, and its leadership burdened by the realization that survival often required foreign intervention. Soldiers who had marched into battle under the empire's banner returned to homes ravaged by conflict, communities struggling to rebuild, and a government attempting to reconcile glory with the brutal cost of war. The empire's fading power had been preserved, but only at a price that would echo through generations. Amid the silence, the human stories emerged. Soldiers walked through frozen villages, counting comrades who would never return. Nurses and medics wept quietly in abandoned hospitals, mourning the men they had tried to save. Families dug graves for sons, brothers, and fathers, sometimes side by side with former enemies, recognizing that death in war did not distinguish loyalty from nationality. In the quiet aftermath, grief became a shared language, transcending borders and empires. The scale of death was staggering. Tens of thousands of men had perished, in battle, in disease, or to the winter that had devoured entire brigades. Families bore the weight of loss silently, letters from battlefields bringing sorrow rather than joy. War, it seemed, had spared nothing in its pursuit of ambition. Youth, health, innocence, and hope all lay shattered across the frozen plains and ruined cities of Crimea. Peace did not erase this toll. It only forced humanity to confront it. Yet even in sorrow, resilience endured. Communities began to rebuild, soldiers returned to fields and workshops, and governments sought to repair fractured trust. Monuments were raised, cemeteries tended, and stories told to honor those who had endured the unimaginable. The war's memory became a cautionary tale, a reminder that ambition, pride, and fear can push nations to the brink, and that peace, when achieved, carries the weight of those who did not survive to witness it. In the fading light over the Black Sea, the landscape was quiet, yet the echoes remained. The smoke had lifted, the snow had melted, but the stories of bravery, suffering, and human endurance lingered. Men who had survived carried the scars of frostbite and fever, hearts heavy with grief, and minds haunted by the horrors they had endured. Peace had come, but it was a fragile, fragile thing, stitched together over the graves of thousands. Europe, for all its treaties and diplomacy, could not hide the human cost. The Crimean War had been avoidable in many respects, yet once set in motion, it had consumed lives without discrimination. Soldiers had died not just to enemy fire but to poor logistics, disease, and mismanagement. Families mourned silently, towns struggled to recover, and empires reflected on pride and ambition's limits. History would remember the war as a military contest, yet its true story lay in the suffering that treaties could never erase. The final lesson of Crimea was unflinching. Peace was not a declaration of triumph. It was a fragile compromise with mortality itself. Empires claimed victories on maps, generals wrote memoirs of strategy, and diplomats toasted agreements. Yet the dead remained, their absence a reminder that no negotiation could repay the human cost. Each grave was a story, a warning, and a testament to the consequences of ambition left unchecked. And so, as Europe exhaled from a war that had seemed endless, the survivors returned to homes forever changed. Mothers buried sons, fathers buried brothers, and lovers mourned those who would never return. Armies carried frostbitten limbs, fevered memories, and the psychological scars of relentless suffering. The guns were silent, the cities still smoldered, and the Black Sea reflected a world exhausted by ambition, pride, and blood. Peace had arrived, but it was written in graves, not glory. The legacy of the Crimean War endured. It was a war remembered not only for battles and sieges, but for the immense human cost that accompanied every strategic decision. It revealed the fragility of empires, the vulnerability of soldiers, and the profound consequences of pride, fear, and miscalculation. History would note treaties and territorial adjustments, yet the true measure of the war lay in the graves, the hospitals, and the silent faces of those who survived. And so, as night fell over the fields of Crimea, the wind whispered across frozen graves and shattered fortresses. The human toll of the war was etched into every snowdrift, every ruined building, and every haunted memory. The Crimean War ended not with triumph or glory, but with reflection, a stark reminder that peace, when won at such cost, is a fragile shadow of the lives it could not save. The echoes of ambition, suffering, and courage would linger forever, a permanent scar on the conscience of Europe.